Greetings, fellow incident nerds, and welcome to season 2 of the Void podcast. The main new thing for this new season is we're now available in video. So if you're listening to this and prefer watching me make odd faces and not a lot, you can find us on YouTube. The link is in the show notes. The other new thing is we now have sponsors. Don't worry, these folks help make the podcast possible, but they don't have any say over who joins us or what we talk about. So fear not. This episode's sponsor is Uptime Labs. Uptime Labs is a pioneering platform specializing in immersive incident response training. Their solution helps technical teams build confidence and expertise through realistic simulations that mirror real-world outages and security incidents. When most of investment these days in the incident space goes to technology and process, Uptime Labs focuses on sharpening the human element of incident response. All right. In this episode, we talked to Simon Newton, head of platforms at Canva. They just published their first public incident report. It's not their first incident, but it's the first time we get to delve into the details of what happened, and we really appreciate them sharing that with us and the world. So let's get into it and talk to Simon. Simon, thank you so much for joining me on the Void podcast. Will you do our listeners a favor and introduce yourself and tell me where you work and what you do?
Yeah, hi. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Simon Newton. I'm the head of platforms at Canva. I've been there about 3 years or so. And platforms at Canva consists of a bunch of different areas. I guess most interesting today, that includes the teams that run our edge and gateway, sort of the front door into Canva, as well as the teams that manage all of our cloud resources. So yeah, Canva, in case you haven't heard of it, is a visual communication company. What we do is make it really easy for people to express their creative ideas to others in a way using visual content. We have a bunch of different products built into what we call the editor. And so we have whiteboards and presentations and responsive docs and websites and drawing tools for making social media posts. So yeah, there's a huge amount you can do.
Yep, that's how I'm going to make the social media posts for this podcast. So thank you all very much at Canva. That's why I was very excited, not for you really, but when I saw this incident report go by. I'm in a Slack group, this resilience and software group, and we have a channel that's just called Cases. And that's honestly, I could sit and watch that all day. So whenever, sometimes we know because things happen to us, but I found out about this incident report and the outage. I did not experience the outage personally, but I did find out about the incident report from the Slack group that I'm in. And I think also I noticed that it's the first one you've ever done, right? I don't recall ever reading a Canva incident report before. So you've had, and in this report, I think you say you've had an internal process since, we're going to get into the incident. But you've had an incident process since 2017, and I'm always so curious about what it is that pushes an organization over the edge. Or, I don't want it to sound so negative, but what brought you to the point where you said, okay, we're going to go to the effort of publishing our first public incident report?
Yeah, and it is a bit more effort, right? We've been publishing incident reports internally, like you said, for many, many years. But there is a difference between, a report for internal consumption and then a polished report for external consumption. So in terms of the why behind it, it's really a reflection of how we're evolving as a company. So Canva, got its start with a bunch of individuals and small businesses. That was sort of typically the user groups. And they'd, be creating social media content and marketing for their small businesses and that sort of material. But in the last couple of years, we've really seen increasing adoption within enterprises. And enterprises bring their own new and different set of customer requirements, right, and customer expectations. And so as part of us wanting to show our commitment to transparency to those enterprise customers, and also because we believe, and I very much believe, that sort of being open about incident reports does benefit the broader industry. And I think the last point there is sort of really important. Yeah, and I love what Void's doing here, right? My take is that I think software engineering generally as a field does a fairly poor job at learning from previous failures. If you look at other engineering fields, often they're more highly regulated, and there's processes around this where failures are well understood and investigated. But in software engineering, we seem to make the same mistakes many times, right? And there's not that sort of like learning as a broader field. And so yeah, very keen on sort of like Void's efforts to see sort of improved education around this, right? So that we can all uplift the industry as a whole.
Thank you for the shameless plug. I appreciate it. I want to ask you the same question I ask everyone at the start of this podcast, which I think is cruel, and yet I do it every time. Can you give a brief summary of what happened?
Sure. I will try and keep it brief. As I'm sure you're aware, right? The large and interesting failures are because of a confluence of factors, right? So in this particular case, there were multiple contributing factors that sort of lined up in a way that caused this much larger incident. But maybe a little bit of background. So the Canva editor is a single page app. We deploy that multiple times a day. And amongst other things, as part of that deploy, we build the JavaScript assets, and then we publish those into an S3 bucket. And so then when clients reload the page, or the editor self-updates, those clients then go and download the new assets via our edge provider. And once those assets are loaded, and the editor is sort of like functional and running, then it starts making API calls to load in all the content. And those API calls also go via our edge provider to what we call our Canva API gateways. And then those gateways route those requests to the various services sort of within our systems, which then will handle them. And I guess the other key bit of information is those gateways run as auto scale groups within our cloud provider, AWS. So in this incident, the first like factor that contributed towards it was we did a deployment of the editor at the same time that there were network issues that were occurring within our edge provider. And now normally, these network issues happen all the time, right? Like the internet is a messy place. This is happening day in and day out. And so normally what happens is our edge provider has automated software that can detect these issues and can mitigate them and route around them. Unfortunately, in this particular case, and again, we only learnt this later, they had a bit of manual stale configuration in place that have prevented that automation from running. So first contributing factor is there's a network issue, and it hasn't been mitigated automatically.
As often happens with those things,
Yes.
unfortunately. Yeah.
Yep. And so then maybe the next bit to discuss is if you consider how the edge proxies work, right? You've got a lot of clients making requests for resources. And if that resource isn't in the local cache of the proxy, it has to go and fetch it from the origin server. And it's very likely that there's multiple clients requesting the same bit of content, right? And so it's pretty inefficient to have the proxy server then go and turn around and request multiple times from the origin. So what you want to do is you want to coalesce all those requests, do a single origin fetch, and then send that content back out to all the clients. And you can probably see where this is going. But with a bunch of clients requesting the same JavaScript asset, and with networking issues.
Is that the sound? Is that like the sound of a thundering herd I hear in the distance?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
that's. Yeah.
But the interesting bit here was, like if everything sort of behaved as it was, as it would normally, your latency would go up because the origin fetches are taking a bit longer. And that's fine. Like, it's just a bit of increased latency for the clients. But where we got really unlucky was one of those origin fetches didn't just go out from measured in milliseconds to seconds. The origin fetch actually took 20 minutes to occur, right? And as I'm sure 20 minutes in computing time is an absolute eternity.
It's like geological time.
Yes.
Yeah. It's geologic time. So yeah, that's rough.
And then when we got particularly unlucky again was that this one particular asset was the JavaScript that loads what we call the object panel in Canva. And so this is the sort of main place where you interact with content in your designs, right? And so without the object panel loading, the editor is essentially, frozen and dead. And what it also means is that once that one bit of JavaScript loads, it then triggers a bunch of API calls because it can start loading the content. So yes, if you've got a fetch taking 20 minutes, you've got all these clients like coalescing and waiting for it, and then suddenly it becomes available. That turns into a very, very large number of API requests hitting the gateways.
Yeah. It's pretty ugly. At that point, things fell over in terms of like the auto scaling and whatnot, right? At some point, it all just like collapsed on top of itself there, right?
Yeah, and so that turned into about, I think it was about 1.5 million API requests in a very, very short amount of time. And that was enough
Yeesh.
to, yeah, overwhelm the gateways. Autoscalers can't react fast enough to that. The gateways went out of memory, and then that started sort of the cascading failure due to overload.
Okay, that's the shortest version of this incident, which is hard. Um, and so I think we'll talk a little bit more about some of these details. But how did you all find out about this?
Yes,
What?
I can run you through that. So the first signs that something was wrong was about 10 minutes after the deploy, because we started noticing a drop in search traffic. And so our search on call team was paged for a drop in traffic. I think they went down around 20% or so. And so they started investigating. And at first they thought like, oh, maybe this is something like very sort of, isolated to search. But as they started communicating in an incident room, it was a Sev 1, which is sort of our second highest tier of incident at that point. As they started communicating, other service owners started getting involved and saying like, oh, actually, like we've also noticed a drop in traffic. Um, and as they were doing that, that was about the time that the fetch itself completed. And then our gateway and edge teams got paged for, massive gateway failures. At that point, the incident was upgraded to a Sev 0. The gateway teams were pulled in. I was pulled in, and the incident coordinator was activated. And then we sort of went from there.
So, what does your incident response look like? How, do you all have sort of some, protocols, or what does that look like? And how many people ended up being involved, if you could tell me, because it sounds like it was a doozy, and a lot of people got called in. I'm always really curious, like how many hands are on deck.
Yeah, I would guess probably at least 20 or so. So let me describe the process. Typically alerts will page service on call teams. I think it's a very typical process, right? Those service teams will triage and open the incident. If it's a Sev 0 or Sev 1, that'll activate the incident coordinator rotation, which is sort of it's a small group of people that have a lot of training and skills around managing and coordinating these large scale incidents. Sev 0s will also page myself, and then it really depends on the incident as to the structure of it, right? If it's a smaller incident, you might have only a handful of people, and they'll be sort of fulfilling all the roles, right? If it's a large incident like in this one, we'll set it up so that there's dedicated people running each particular role. I think maybe one thing that's important as well is that the larger or the higher severity incidents, we'll automatically assign a representative from our customer support organization. And they'll be the ones that will
Oh,
be
okay.
coalescing all of the user reports, and sort of looking for signal there to not overwhelm the sort of the responding team. And then they're also the channel back
Hmm.
into the user support, so that they can feedback like, look, this is the state of things. If people are, contacting or reaching out to Canva, this is what we should be telling them. If there's anything they can do, to mitigate it from a user perspective, that as well. Yeah, and then post incident, like I mentioned, we'll write those incident reports, and then we also we've just fairly recently started using AI to try and extract common themes across all of those reports as well, to sort of look for areas where we can improve.
I have so many questions. So the ICs getting pulled in sort of automatically if it's like Sev 1, Sev 0. Is that team? Are they also engineers on different teams? Are they kind of a dedicated SRE-esque function? And when they're not ICing, what are they doing? I'm kind of curious what the shape of that looks like.
Yeah, so early on, I would say our ICs were just sort of a bunch of very experienced, sort of battle-hardened engineers at Canva, right? Um, and then over time, of course, as we get bigger, we need to sort of set up a dedicated function. And those, because those folks are also, they've got their own projects, right? Their own deliverables that they're working on. So yeah, IC is a dedicated function at Canva. When they're not on call, they're doing bunch of other different things. Some of those is improving the incident process itself, looking for those patterns in incidents. Plus also there's a bunch of work that goes into our large launch events. So we do two main launches a year, and we've got one coming up now in April. And so they're sort of like doing a bunch of planning for that. There's a bunch of capacity planning involved. Like understanding the risk and mitigating the risks that are sort of unique to each one of those launches. And so yeah,
Mhm.
that's like a dedicated reliability function.
When you have like a pretty big incident like this one, do you have execs in the channels, in the active incident channels? Or do you have a dedicated role who's talking to folks and kind of coordinating back or forth? What does that look like?
Yeah, so in this particular case, our founders did join the incident channel. Um, Typically what will happen, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're busy with other things. Typically like myself or sort of one of the other senior leaders will act as that channel to the founders to give them updates and help them understand what's going on.
So you mentioned you found out later. So was the Cloudflare wrinkle of their traffic, and you didn't mention this explicitly, but I think this is what you're getting at, the network configuration. So their traffic was going over the public internet, not over their private backbone. Is that a piece of it that you found out later? And so that was sort of like, you didn't know why that was contributing to the problem?
Yes, yes. Yes, I mean, we don't have visibility into that traffic between, Cloudflare and our origin
Yeah.
running in AWS. So yes, that was a detail that we didn't find out until I think maybe like 1 or 2 days after the incident as we were working with Cloudflare to understand what happened.
At, at some point, did anyone have the intuition that this was going to get worse in the way that it did? Like once the files were downloaded from the origin server and there was, did you see that, hear the thundering herd coming? Like I'm always a little curious what the existential dread might be like in an
Oh.
incident, or did that catch you by surprise as well?
It all happened, like, fairly quickly in terms of
Okay.
the unfolding incident. So yeah, by the time that folks were in the room saying like, "Oh, this is broader than search," that was about the time that origin fetch completed, and then the gateways starting falling over.
And so that, so even so the like the all the clients hitting the API gateway, you've got a known performance issue. So that all happened really quickly. Or were pieces of those only aware after the fact as well?
Yes, I didn't actually touch on the performance side. So, as this is
Let's
all
get into that
unfolding,
then.
yeah,
I jumped ahead.
as the gateways are now, now crashing, we have a bunch of people on the call, and that's sort of where we started breaking up into different work streams, right? So, there were a set of people that were responsible for contacting our vendors, and getting them involved. And that process differs across vendors, right? Like some of them will be like, we'll go to our portal and submit like a P0 request. Others will be like, email this address and it will page sort of your on-call account managers. And so that process there, needs to be well practiced, right? And I think this is actually something that something we improved afterwards as well. We have internal docs on how to escalate to each of our vendors, but we tidied up that documentation and just made it a bit clearer, because when you're doing that, you're already in a high stress environment, right? And so you don't want to load a documentation page
Absolutely.
and have 4 pages of workflow to go through. It needs to be a very clear, do these 4 things, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, we had a set of people sort of contacting vendors. We had one of the engineers who was not on call at the time, but was, saw the incident and jumped on, as many people sort of at Canva do, right? There's a very good culture of sort of like banding together, especially for these large incidents. So we had one engineer who went off and started profiling the gateway. And so as this is all emerging, he was reporting back in saying like, "Oh, look, actually, the profile looks different." I think if I remember correctly, he actually he'd done this before other times, and so he had past profiles to compare it to. And he was like, "Look, when I did this like 2 weeks ago, like this one looks different, right? And I'm seeing lock contention here." And so that was sort of like one avenue that we thought might have been the contributing factor. And so we had a bunch of people exploring that. That turned out to be a change in our metrics library. What we were doing was making some changes to the way that metrics were collected. And so we were integrating a third-party library there. And what that had done is inadvertently put metric registration behind a lock. and so the capacity of our gateways were reduced, which would then also contribute to the sort of like the overload situation, and what we saw with the cascading failure. But that was all sort of emerging in parallel to the to the rest of
Yeah.
the activity that was happening on the call.
So you got the performance issue, which must have been, and if I'm not wrong, there was this really juicy detail in there. These are the kinds of things that I love it when companies share, where it was a known issue and there was a fix for it in like the deployment pipeline for that day that
Yes.
had not gone out yet. And in many organizations, there could be a lot of blame and like post hoc, like, I can't believe we didn't do that. We should have. Like, what was the general sense when you all realized that that also was contributing to this incident?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely there was never any blame, right? It was just very unfortunate that yes, the metrics team had already identified this, they'd already fixed it, it was already merged, and I guess what would that have been in like 12 hours later, the new gateway would have been deployed, and this may have looked very
Oof.
very different, right? So that was
Yeah.
just unlucky. We do have a project underway. To move to incremental deploys. Right now, I'd say most backend components are deployed on a daily cycle, and then sort of the components individually can opt into incremental deploys, and sort of deploy on merge. But we do want to sort of move more and more of our components to like over to that incremental model, which would have ideally caught this in this case.
And so then the last but not least, certainly, I believe, again, if I've got the timeline right here. So you've got that going on. And then basically you had like the load balancers on your ECS containers, just they couldn't, like, they were just getting hammered at this point as well, right? And was that also a matter of sort of this was reaching out and trying to figure out what was happening with AWS, or like what was that last piece of the puzzle like?
Yeah, so we did, we had a set of people escalating Cloudflare. We had a set of people reaching out to AWS, because, we were at that point, this was sort of just after that origin fetch had completed. Um, we were concerned that there might be something going on that AWS side. But thankfully, we have, I would say, like reasonably good observability into all of this, right? And a cascading failure due to overload is a very distinct pattern in a graph, right? Where you get this sawtooth pattern. Like if you're looking at
Yeah.
instance uptime, you get this sawtooth that's sort of offset with every instance. And so, I've certainly seen that before. A number of other people on the call have seen that before. And so it was very clear at that point. It's like, oh no, this is an overload situation. And then again, we've sort of faced this before, right? I've seen quite a few of these, and there's really only one option, which is like you've got to bring the load down and get the system back into a stable state, right? You can try and add capacity. The problem is unless you can do that in sort of an atomic flip fashion, any new additional capacity that you bring up is just going to get hammered into the ground. And so you've got to cut that load back. In this
Yeah.
particular case, what would be really nice if we had a sort of a lever where we could just say like, oh, okay, great, like dial the load to 20% of sort of the incoming demand. We didn't have that sort of control within the cloud providers' systems. So instead, what we did was reach for the sort of country level controls, right? And so we put in a block that said, for any country in the world, we want to display this status message instead of forwarding the requests onto the back end. So that was the lever that we had at the time, right? And then what
Yeah.
we started doing was once we got that block in place, we saw the traffic drop to zero, we saw all the gateways come up and stabilize, and then we started admitting more load. I think maybe the interesting bit here is that we added Europe back in first, because that was where the peak load of the time was, right? This happened in sort of Australian, like early to mid evening time, which would have been European daytime. The US was mostly asleep at that point. And so we targeted Europe to be admitted back first, and then rolled out to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting piece of what I like to think of as hard-earned expertise, where instead of just turning everything back on again and literally recreating potentially the same problem, which I've definitely seen incidents where they're like, "Oh no," and it like literally happens again. The only other piece I was curious about is in terms of what that instant response looks like. Is like, are people remote? Is everything in a Slack channel? How does that work? Is everybody in the same time zone? How complicated does that look for you all?
Yeah, so Canva is a hybrid work setup. So I'd say the bulk of our engineering is sort of in the New Zealand to west coast of Australia time zone. Um, and so yeah, this was sort of like early to mid evening for them. Uh, but yes, as part of the automation, when an incident is triggered, it automatically creates a Slack room. It ties that Slack room to the main incident Slack room, so people can go in there and find it, and it sets up the Zoom call as well. And so then I'd say the majority of the discussion occurs on Zoom. Maybe another interesting point is that we have deliberately set up that Zoom in a way that the Zoom chat is disabled. So it funnels all of the chat through the Slack room, so we can capture it for
Ah,
later.
okay. Yeah.
And then you don't have two different sort of text
2
conversations
sources of
happening. Yep.
yeah. Yeah.
And so typically people will share, will be sharing links to dashboards or logs or etc. in the Slack channel. And then we have a way of annotating within the Slack channel sort of key moments, right? In a way that it's very easy to when you're going back later trying to write that incident report, you can sort of pull out the key events and say like, okay, this is what we knew at this particular time.
Is that a homegrown tool that you all use, or is that that's a third party tool
I
for the
think it,
incident sort of
yeah, I think it's mostly a bunch of tools developed by that same set of incident coordinators.
So some companies say, for Sev whatever number, we're gonna always have an incident review and we're gonna try to do it within this amount of time. And do you have like a dedicated incident analysis team and with analysts, and do they have processes around that and timeframes for when you want things to happen, or is that more ad hoc?
Yeah, so we don't have a dedicated team of people analyzing these. The incident coordinators will work with the sort of service teams that were contributing towards the incident. And then we have a template for the PIRs, what we call them. Um, I don't think there is a sort of a set deadline. But certainly, myself, I'll be, because I'll be involved in the Sev Zeros, I'll be looking for that report, right? And if it hasn't shown up in maybe like two or 3 weeks, I'll be pinging people saying like, where is it at that point? But no sort of
Mhm.
like automated system that that like pings it.
Right.
It is all linked in the in that automation in that Slack room as well. So as the state moves through from like responding, so I guess like triage responding to mitigated to resolved, that's all getting captured as
Yeah.
well, and fed into that timeline.
Is there like a PIR meeting anyone can come to? Like, how are the reports shared internally?
Yeah, so it's then published when it is published. It's done typically as like the last message in that Slack room. Before that then gets archived. We have a weekly meeting as well where we review the Sev zeros plus like some of the other lesser severity but maybe like interesting failure modes. And then we publish in our sort of monthly engineering leads meeting. We take the list of incidents, and we go through them briefly there. That's sort of so that all the engineering leads have the same level of visibility, and that we're sort of identifying common themes.
Do you find that those reports get referenced in like planning, or are they used? Do you see them being used after the fact, as sort of learning pieces in terms of either, yes, for planning or for architecture reviews or like any of those kinds of things?
Yeah, so the action items that come out of those reports get created in Jira, which will then be sitting on those teams' backlogs. And so then, next planning iteration, the team will be looking at their sort of like reliability backlog, and then sort of like mixing that with the other sort of various categories of work on the backlog, and then using that to prioritize what work occurs.
And is there anything outside of action items in terms of like distributing what you learned? Or is there any other activity around the incidents like that?
I'd say no, other than the sort of internal Slack channels where these get published,
Yeah.
right? And so anyone in the company is free to go and look at those, and read through the reports.
What was the most surprising thing to you about this incident?
Yeah, probably the biggest one is that our edge provider would coalesce requests indefinitely, right? I can understand, I can understand why that was the outcome, right? And I can imagine, I can put myself in the person writing that code, and it's like, oh, like if fetch in flight, like wait for it to complete and then respond, right? But that was what allowed that thundering herd to develop, right? Um, and all of our internal RPC traffic has timeouts, which are sort of propagated and respected at each hop in that service graph. But in this particular case, there wasn't sort of like any timeout within that edge provider's layer, which makes it somewhat difficult from a client code perspective to understand. Is this an error? Is this just like a slow fetch, right? Or is this like, am I part of a thundering herd, right? In which case, like I
Hey,
as the client would want to do something differently, like add some back off there and
right.
yeah.
Yeah, it definitely seemed like one of the themes from this incident as well was, and I mean, I see this a lot and I write about it a lot, was how automation actually made it worse, right? And not because you're like, we want the automation to make things worse, but because it can't always react to these kinds of situations. And, its model of the world is not as flexible as ours is. And so, I definitely saw like action items out of that and everything in the report, but was there, what was there any reaction to that in terms of like where you had these automation surprises of and not just like what was your response to the sort of automation making it harder, and how are you all adapting to that after the fact for the future?
Yeah, so maybe a good example is, I didn't mention this, but part of what happened on that call was there was a person responsible for freezing the auto scaling, right? Because what can happen here is your traffic goes to zero, your autos, especially if that's like over a sort of like fairly long amount of time. The auto scalers are like, oh great, like we can like downscale all of the groups, and then the traffic comes back, and
Yeah.
then of course they can't scale up fast
And
enough.
like, oh
Um,
no, again.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've got processes in place where for those particular types of incidents, we have tooling that we can run, again, sort of developed by those reliability folks, where we can say like, hey, like freeze all the auto scalers. And what we can do also is go back and say like, oh, actually, set them, like reset them to where they were, sort of like prior to the incident occurring, right? So if any have downscaled, we can get them back. And so that's a process that we've sort of adapted, given past experience and sort of thinking through what's like bad outcomes that could happen in these sort of events, that like turns the automation off for a second and lets humans
Yeah.
take control. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely a theme of obviously my work, but like instead of just saying, well, we'll add more automation to make the automation better, y'all were like, well, let's give the humans better controls over what that might look like. I like seeing those kinds of adaptations.
Yeah, I'm a very big fan of sort of modes within automated software where it just sort of like throws up its hands and it says, like this does not match my view, like what I've been modeled for, and like humans, please get
Yeah.
involved, right? When I've been building
Yeah.
systems in the past, I've built in these lockdown modes, right, where it's like, hey, like the inputs don't match anymore. I'm going to go into lockdown mode. I'm going to flag it in my telemetry, and like human,
Yeah.
come and get me out of this, right? Because rather than just sort of like continuing down a path that sort of no one has prepared the software for, and possibly making
Yeah.
things much worse.
And yeah, what do you think was the biggest learning for the team out of this incident?
So I think definitely practicing those controls on the edge providers network. When we were putting that block in place, we added it with a very simple status message. I can't actually remember what it said, but it was definitely not a user friendly status message, right?
Oh, no.
Because at the
All bad, good luck. Yeah.
wasn't quite that bad. But
Okay.
because at the time it was like,
I
look,
can come up with a lot of bad error messages for you if you'd like, but probably not.
yeah. So because at the time the priority was like get the load down rather than, debate the error message or, like how it was going to be visually presented, etc. Right. And so
Yeah.
now we've learned from that. We now have sort of a canned response ready to go, in a much more user friendly and visually appealing style. And so that's sort of like one thing that's come out of that. Plus also sort of our ability to practice using those controls and getting more familiar with them. Because you really don't want to be using something for the first time, sort of in a high pressure environment, right? Like you want to have this, like built up almost in your muscle memory. One of the other sort of like general principles that I try and ascribe to when building these systems is that any sort of emergency or failure mode is exercised day to day, right? And that way, you're prepared for it. You've been using it, like day to day or sort of once a week, and it's not I've got to do this this thing first time in a call. Again, there's like a documentation page that is like 4 pages long, right? And I've got to execute these
Yeah.
sequence of steps perfectly, right? Like
The oven's on fire,
not,
and I've never used the like fire extinguisher thing before, and it can't get basically.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, you want to be like, oh,
And
yep.
do you do drills like tabletop drills, chaos engineering type stuff, or what does that preparedness look like? How is that
Yeah. So
structured
there's,
and definitely happens?
I'd say there's a variety of drills that occur, right? Like teams themselves will do sort of Wheel of Misfortune style or like role playing incidents. But then there's also like larger drills that we do as a company, where we say like, oh, okay, yes, we're going to do like a sort of a business continuity drill. And then our storage teams will get involved and do those exercises.
Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your internal process with the world. And while I hope you don't have more Sub-Zero incidents, I do hope that you continue to share your incident reports with us. And I really appreciate all of the time and effort and cat herding that goes into that. But as you said, it really is so beneficial to everyone else in the industry. So thank you for doing it.
Yeah, no worries. And yeah, I hope people can learn from it and we can get better, everyone together.
Absolutely. Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.